Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Western security officials have identified a coordinated and ongoing campaign to destabilize pretty much all of Europe. The group, known as Unit 29155, has operated for at least a decade, yet Western officials only recently discovered it. That's right. It's been around for about 10 years, causing chaos, destabilizing Europe, and we're just now finding out about it. It may not sound all that important, but if I told you that this group was responsible for one of the poisonings in the United Kingdom, was associated potentially with the 2016 election scandal and various other incidents across the world, so not just the United States, not just Britain, but all over Europe, and that their mission comes from the Kremlin directly with a directive to assassinate and take out key people across the globe. Hopefully that would explain why you care. It is part of an ongoing effort, again, that's been going on for quite a while now. We don't know exactly how long, but at least a decade, probably longer. And so we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to try to break this down for you, tell you what we know about the group. This information is from a New York Times article, a New York Times reporter who spoke to a security official who chose to remain anonymous due to the sensitivity of the information. But of course, we can't begin this critical conversation without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
And while the only political comment I'm going to make is the main supporter of this group and this organization is President Trump's good friend, Vladimir Putin. And there's another reason to care, is that we have our current leadership seems to be very supportive of the man who is behind organizing all of these missions and this disruption. So that
seems to be.
I'm done. So
okay, seems to be. But
this is where those of us who
could be a case of keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
That is
right?
true. But this is where those of us who are Cold War veterans have not cared for Putin and always been leery of Vladimir Putin, which makes us sometimes a little bit upset with what seems to be a type of relationship that we don't feel like we should have with somebody who's a former member of the defunct KGB.
So we're going to start breaking this down. We're not, for those thinking that this may be about the 2016 election, it's really not.
No,
In fact,
isn't.
Most of what this group has done isn't related to that. There's actually another group, special unit, that talks about this. We're looking at this unit and the bigger picture surrounding Russia's current position on the world stage and what it means for us. So we're going to break this down in the next two segments, talk a little bit of history. Lance, of course, being the senior resident historian at TrueChat, will bring in that perspective for us. And then in the last bit of the show, we're going to talk about how should we be handling Russia? Should we be doing something differently? And if so, what does that look like? So we've got a lot to get through. We're going to dive right in. The article says the following: the purpose of Unit 29155, which had not been previously reported, underscores the degree to which Russian President Vladimir Putin is actively fighting the West with his brand of so-called hybrid warfare. That's a blend of propaganda, hacking, attacks, and disinformation, as well as an open military confrontation, referring to a number of different encounters, but obviously the annexation of Crimea is part of this that we'll look at as well. First came a destabilization campaign in Moldova, followed by the poisoning of an arms dealer in Bulgaria, and then a thwarted coup in Montenegro. Last year, there was an attempt to assassinate a former Russian spy in Britain using a nerve agent. So a lot of different places.
Very active, right?
Very active.
And we're just now, though, the different intelligence organizations are starting to put this together of the actions of one group. Because before, they kind of thought that they were just isolated incidents. And now, as they're uncovering more information, the point of this article is that this has all been pretty much a planned out concept for the last 10, 12 years, right? I mean, that's the scary part to this, is that we all knew about these incidents, and it's like, wonder what that's happening.
They weren't just random.
Wonder what rogue group is out there doing these kinds of activities throughout Eastern Europe and even Western Europe. But now we're finding out that no, this has all been planned out, and it's all part of a bigger master plan that the Russian government has.
One of the reasons that we didn't know this is the ultra secret nature of this group. And when I say secret, I mean it. The article says its operations, referring to Unit 29155, are so secret, according to assessments by Western intelligence services, that the unit's existence is most likely unknown even to other GRU operatives, the GRU being intelligence services in Russia. So think about that, right? It's so secret that even other people working in Russian intelligence don't know that it exists. Part of its secrecy, Lance, comes from its shoestring budget and its flying under the radar type operations, which the article highlights, right? This is a group that it never stays in fancy hotels. It doesn't drive fancy cars. It operates out of a nondescript building, an old Soviet era building.
Well, and even within Russia, they don't live extravagantly.
No.
It's not like they're being taken care of and drawing attention to themselves within Russia as well. They're living in, small apartments and driving old beat up cars and everything else. But it also points out that these are some of the most decorated soldiers in the country of Russia in the last 10 to 15 years. So, and I think Putin even makes the point to talk about them as important as the Red Army spies to defeat the Nazis and everything else. So historically, when Putin talks about them publicly, this organization publicly, he doesn't talk about 29155, but when he talks about his intelligence organization, he talks about the work they're doing is as important as the work that the Red Army intelligence did during World War II. So obviously held in very high esteem and working very closely with the government of Russia now, in trying to destabilize Europe.
So there's definitely a history to this, Lance. I mean, that's for sure. And we're going to dive even deeper to that in the coming bit here. But I think one of the things that's so important when we're looking at this is understanding that we don't want to downplay what Russia's doing. We also don't want to hype it up too much. I always debate when we cover things like this, I think obviously we're covering it because we want people to know, right? I mean, that's first and foremost.
Well, it's just interesting to me, caught my attention because it's so much bigger than just the 2016 election, which is why I hope people have continued to listen, that this isn't rehashing the 2016 election. We're not even going to talk about it other than saying that comparing the activities of this group are much larger than even that, which is a huge issue within the United States. But it's just amazing that we've allowed the Russians this kind of activity since the end of the Cold War, and thinking everything was all hunky dory and great relationships and everything else. And then to see that this is a plan, and like you said, it's a hybrid attack. It's a three-pronged attack to destabilize the West so that Russia, and we've talked about this for the last 4 or 5 years on some of our older programs about how Putin wants to bring Russia back to where Russia was as a world power, that they're not necessarily a world player, but all of this that we're talking about today is part of the plan of Putin to bring Russia back to that kind of level of importance.
And you mentioned at the beginning, and I meant to clarify it then, just because I think it's important that people know, for reference, that you said, Cold War veteran. I mean, you grew up during this time, right? During the Cold War.
Sure. When I was in junior high and high school, I wasn't sure that I would live to be 58 years old and that the world would still exist in the fashion that it does, because, the atomic bomb clock was right there. And at some point we're going to go to some kind of nuclear war and blow everything up. That's the way we were taught things were going to end. I mean, from
So it starts
being a young child during the Cuban Missile Crisis to the fall of the Berlin Wall, I always felt that it was not going to end well for the world with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union.
So real quick background, because we have a lot of younger listeners, I think. I mean, ones who weren't alive during this time. And even for the ones that were, I think it's a good recap to remember that the Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union with its satellite states and the United States of America with its allies after World War II.
Forces in World War II to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese and then the Italians at first, but basically those groups, but it was an unlikely,
right,
ally because they had a system of government, communism, that we were totally against with our democracy. And so when the war was over, there was much distrust between the two countries, and they spent basically the next 40, 45 years both trying to dominate the world, saying the more countries we can get that either become democracies or become communist, the stronger we will be and we will become the superpower. And so it was kind of for our listeners under 30, the United States has always been on top.
Right.
We've always been the superpower. Nobody else even, China's coming up. But during my life, my early lifetime, until my 30s or 40s, it was going to be who was going to win this race to be a superpower. That was known as the Cold War. Was it going to be the Soviet Union or was it going to be the United States?
And the term cold is used, by the way, in case you're wondering, because there were no large scale fighting directly between the United States and Russia, mostly technological and third party battles, not a lot of direct U.S. Soviet forces fighting one another, like in the World Wars, for example.
The largest being Vietnam, or now I guess you could argue Afghanistan, because to most Americans, we fought in Afghanistan. Well, the Russians were there first, and we were supporting the Mujahideen rebels to kick out the Russians. And then
that was kind of a war by proxy then.
Right.
I mean, as most of the things were during the Cold War, Russia and America were fighting all the time. They just weren't.
But they were fighting through other groups of people.
U.S. troops versus Russian troops most of the time. U.S. troops versus Russian-backed forces,
giving
or vice
supplies
versa,
and different weapons and all of those kinds of things on both sides. The United States and the Soviet Union doing both of those things.
So we're going to continue to break down the Kremlin's bigger motive and Russia as a whole. What are they after here? What's Putin really trying to do? Yeah, he's trying to destabilize Europe, but why? What's the key there? Is it just to return Russia to its former glory, quote unquote, or is there something else at play? Well, we've got that to discuss, and as always, you can follow along with the New York Times article at thestateofus.org. We've got it linked there, trying to make sure that you have access to the same information. More to come on Russia and the future of our democracy, so stick around, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Western security officials have identified a coordinated and ongoing campaign to destabilize Europe and possibly the globe. This is an effort by various Russian groups, including the Russian group known as Unit 29155. A handful of various groups with the mission, as the article reads, that the Kremlin sees Russia as being at war with a Western liberal order that it views as an existential threat. Keep in mind, right, that prior to World War II, and even during World War II, the power makeup was relatively different. More of the world's power was shared with communist and dictatorships than it is now. And that's kind of, you could argue, what was at stake in World War II. Was the world going to move in a democratic direction or in a dictatorial, trying to think of a better word than just that, kind of
dictatorial state-run government.
Yeah.
How's that?
To be concise.
Okay.
What we mean by that is governments where there were people who had a supreme amount of power, and where if you fit a very particular mold, then, you could probably have an okay life. If you didn't fit that, then depending on which society you were in, you probably either didn't live very well, or in the case of the Nazis, you didn't live at all. So that was kind of, you could say on an ideological level, right? That's what it boiled down to. Obviously, there was a ton of other stuff that came into play and the reason for the war and all of that. But from an ideological perspective, that's sort of what's at stake. I think what happened to Russia, Lance, tell me if I'm wrong from the historical standpoint here, but what happened to them is they realized, oh crap, the Nazis are going to be a real problem for us. Mm-hmm. Even though they share kind of, sort of, a little bit more in common with us than they do with democracy. Well,
the guy in charge of the Nazis hated the communists.
Right.
So they were, that's why they were kind of the Soviets were the unseemly bedfellows with the democracies, was because Hitler.
We shared a common enemy.
That's right.
It became clear as time went on in World War II that Russia was not going to be friends with the Nazis. So when we study Western European history, the United States, its allies, the people not aligned with the Soviet Union, I think the shame is that we mostly focus on their perspective when we look at World War II. And we kind of forget that Russia was going through this awful, terrible war kind of on their own against the Nazis, that spanned many years and was, just awful for them. If they didn't have as many people as they had, they may have lost because they just would have run out of soldiers.
Right. Well, they lost millions, in the war, and the United States did not. We lost 300 and something thousand, I think 350,000, 400,000 men, which was horrible. And really, we talked about it and ad infinitum in our country, but the Russians, I think, lost over 10 million people. And to the Russians, one of the names that they give to World War II is the Great Patriotic War, because people, the things that happened to them were on a scale that we didn't see here in the United States. So that it's just a different, we look on it very favorably and call it the greatest generation ever, and recognize these people and all they did. And they did do all of these things. But to the Soviet Union / Russia, World War II was even a greater intensity than it was for us. And we don't, as you point out, very well, we don't always study it that way or talk about that.
So about 11 million Soviet Union soldiers perished in the war. And an estimated 26 million Soviet citizens died during World War II. Just not even close to any other single nation.
Right.
And
that's not taking anything away from what everybody else lost and particularly what the United States lost. I'm not poo-pooing what happened to us. It was huge, but we don't always study and point out when we do study World War II, the big dramatic effect this had on the Russian people and the Russian government.
Think about that, right? We talk about, the Holocaust and, how many Jews died and all of this during World War II, right? And how many Allied troops and all of that. But the United States, official military deaths accounted about 416,000. You were close. But
spot on twice. I said more than 10 million. You said 11 million for the Soviet Union. And I said 300,000 to 400,000 for the United States. And you said 400 and what?
416,000.
Right. That's with no computers or anything. Yeah. That's just off the top of the old guy's head.
800. So,
yeah. There we go. I'll take that. I was in the ballpark.
Keep that in mind. I guess the Soviet Union technically has a range, 8.8 million to like 10.7 million,
sure.
But, that's.
Well, and who do you classify as soldiers? Because there were so many civilian deaths and everything else, but 400,000 to 8 million.
Yeah. Everybody else added together doesn't total what the Soviets went through.
Exactly.
And that's just their military deaths. You bring in the civilians and military deaths together, and now you're at like 24 million. Just devastated. And the reason this is so important, and the reason Lance and I are spending time on this, is you have to take this into account about where they were where they ended after World War II. And they were basically left with a world mostly united around us, the United States, the victors, and the Allied forces, and not them.
And they were victorious.
Right.
And they probably sacrificed as much, if not more than anyone else. And then everybody else is moving on and they're kind of left isolated on their own.
Right.
So now that
devastated economically, devastated from a civilian and military standpoint. I mean, just, a war worse than anything that we can imagine.
And worried about people coming after them, because there were people within the American military machine who said, well, since we have all of our troops and supplies here already, let's go ahead and go into the Soviet Union and finish them off. And President Truman said, no, we're done fighting the devastation of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all the deaths, and Americans are tired of war and we need to rebuild. But there was a push by certain people within the American military to say, let's just go in and wipe out Russia while we're at it. Mm-hmm. So understand it. We're trying to get you to understand it from the Russian perspective, because we always look at it from our perspective. So
yeah. And
that's why they're on the defensive and always out there attacking, and they don't trust the West, because even though they ended up on the victorious side, they've constantly felt threatened that the West was going to try to take them over.
And the current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, right? He's born October 7th of 1952. So literally immediately following this, his parents, right? They lived through this. He's growing up in a Russia that with all these adults around him who lived through this,
right,
and who feel that the world has closed in on them, and that where they were and where they are, is just a bad state of affairs. It's not a bright, happy time in the Soviet Union. And then not only that, but as we know, he goes on to work for the KGB, and he watches the downfall of the USSR. The Soviet Union. Sorry, I shouldn't have just said that without explanation. But
United Soviet Socialist Republics.
Right. But you watch the downfall of your nation, literally, it crumble underneath of you. And then you become the very thing that you were fighting against, which is a democracy. Because that is, in fairness, that is what Russia became for
a very short period of time.
Right. That's supposedly what they are now.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they actually, with Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin and some of the leaders at that time, they tried to transition, perestroika, and tried to transition into a democracy, which didn't work very well for them, because you had a group of people who had always depended upon the state for housing and food and power, electricity, things like that. And all of a sudden in a democracy, it's like, well, now you're free. Now you make your choices. You work where you want to work. You live where you want to work. You make money how you want to make money. And the Russian economy was not ready for that. And all of a sudden people said, wow, this freedom thing was really good, except I'm living even worse than I did under the state-run government. And the people started asking for the government to step in and make sure I have a place to live, that I have, because there is no unemployment in communist Russia, because everybody has a job. They find
works.
something. And, we know in a democracy, you do have a certain level of unemployment, and you do have a certain level of poor. And so it was just too much too fast. And they've now tacked to the right politically and have more of a state controlled economy and totalitarian government, which they felt comfortable with.
And important in understanding where Mr. Putin fits into all this, President Putin. So you've got Boris Yeltsin, President Boris Yeltsin, right? Mm-hmm. First president of Russia from the inception of the Russian Federation, which is Russia's actual, technical.
Russia is one of the 15 republics that made up the United Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or what we refer to as the Soviet Union in history.
Yes.
So Russia was one of those 15. And then with perestroika and Mikhail Gorbachev, it broke up to, okay, everybody's independent.
Yes.
And,
and now it's not quite that way. We've brought,
you've got all the stands and the Russians and
Mm-hmm.
the Czechs and, all kinds of different groups now, but there were 15 different governments.
Right. So you've got Boris Yeltsin, first president, starts July 10th, 1991 to December 31st of 1999. Immediately preceded by Vladimir Putin from May 7th of 2000 to May 7th of 2008. He served his 2 terms. Then comes Dmitry, is it Medvedev? Sorry. Anyway, no disrespect. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but he served from May 7th of 2008 to May 7th of 2012. And of course, then as you know now, serving since then has been again, Vladimir Putin.
Medvedev was the handpicked successor by Putin.
Right.
So many thought that he was just a puppet of Vladimir Putin, and Putin had to get the constitution in Russia changed so that he could go back and be president again. And as soon as that happened, then Putin was elected president, elected in air quotes.
Yes. So the history here is, Russia's not been a quote unquote federation very long. And in its short history, the majority of that time, it's been occupied, its leadership role, the president of Russia, by Vladimir Putin. And he's done things during his reign to degrade the original constitutional powers of the legislature, and the judiciary bodies, and consolidate power back into the executive branch of government. And that's part of where all of this, speaking to and tying into this mission, what I said right when we began the segment, Lance, the Kremlin sees Russia as being at war with a Western liberal order that it views as an existential threat.
Exactly.
In 2006, during Mr. Putin's first term, he signed a law. Well, I guess it was his second term, signed a law legalizing targeted killings abroad. The same year, a team of Russian assassins used a radioactive isotope to murder another former Russian spy in London. So, almost from the get-go, right? Mm-hmm. Make no mistake that President Putin isn't here for the good of the democracy known as the Russian Federation, right? Whether or not he ever admits it publicly, he is there. I do believe, Lance, right? He believes deep down, I'm here to do what's best for Russia. The problem is he's very patriotic, right? I mean, there's no, he loves Russia. And,
very nationalistic.
Yes. And he believes that what's best for Russia is to go back to being a more consolidated Soviet Union type entity. Maybe not communist exactly, but something along those lines. So hopefully spending this segment on that, I think, Lance, has been important to understanding.
He wants Russia to become a major player on the world stage again.
Yeah.
Like it was during the Cold War.
And he sees the path to that as going back.
Right.
To what did work at one point. I mean, in fairness, right? Russia being a very substantial world, I mean, still is, but was a much more substantial world power, bigger economy, controlled more territory, all of that.
Yep.
And then he grows up in an era where they've been decimated by war. And then he watches the fall of the very government that he believed brought them success. So that's important, I think, to bring into play. So we spend time on this, Lance. We're talking about Russia today because of TrueChat's mission, right?
And our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
So how do we handle this? Understanding, right, who is Putin? What's his motivation? We've talked about that. What's Russia's prerogative under Putin? But we got to talk about, so what do we do? How do you handle somebody like this? And we're going to look at that. So stick around and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Western security officials have identified a coordinated and ongoing campaign to destabilize Europe by Russian security officials in the GRU. We've been talking about At the beginning of the show, we discussed the group known as Unit 29155, which was the subject of this New York Times piece. In the second part of the show, we gave you a little background on Russia, but also the man in charge right now, Vladimir Putin. We're quick to demonize Russia. And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean Lance and I. I think we've probably done that a little bit over the years, but we're quick to demonize Russia as an entity. And part of why I think it's so important that we took time to do that history lesson in the second segment is hopefully reminding people what shaped the man who's in charge of Russia and who's leading it down this road. Because one of the things, and I shared this with Lance ahead of time, that worries me when we talk about Russia is we group an entire body of people together and we make it sound like everybody in Russia feels this way. And in recent years, even just this year, we saw mass protests by people when they felt that local elections were being manipulated. You know, people are trying to be heard. The Russian people are trying to make some changes, and they don't necessarily feel like it's being handled fairly.
Yes, I agree with that totally. But in all fairness, the rest of the world sees the United States as what President Trump is saying and doing. So I think part of that is just human nature, is that we see
your leader is what
the people are. Yes. But you are correct in that not everybody in Russia thinks what Putin is doing is a good thing. Just like here in the United States, not everybody always agrees with whomever our president is with what they're doing. But outside the borders of any country, we see the people in that country through the actions of their leaders.
Well, and I always point out too, because it is really important to highlight, part of how people see America, especially in today's age, and I know Lance isn't really part of the social media scene, but there is a difference in the generations that, live in these mediums. Millennials, Gen Z. We talked about totally different episode, didn't have anything to do with Russia, but how we view ourselves more. And when I say we, I mean millennials and Gen Z view themselves more as people, right? Humans.
Right.
And there's an erosion of the nationalism, or patriotism, I guess you could say, if we want to be a little less harsh.
Among the younger generations.
Yes.
Because they can connect with people from other countries and find out and share ideas and share interest and share likes. And then therefore it breaks down those borders, so to speak, of getting along with each other. And we've read a couple articles that we haven't talked about yet that show how social media is one way how we're finding out about some of the atrocities in the world in these countries that have a hold on the media, who don't have First Amendment rights. Right. And social media is one way that we're learning about what's going on in Hong Kong and in China and in Syria and other places. And so that too leads into what you're explaining, how young people or people who are tuned into social media are becoming much more citizens of the world and not just citizens of their country.
Well, and with that and having a free press, right? For example, if we talk to people in the United Kingdom, I'm sure that many of them, they'd be super aware, right, that the 2016 election was very divisive. And even though President Trump, to some of them, may mar our image and to others may bolster it, on both sides, they consciously can keep in mind, well, yeah, but not all Americans like him and not all Americans hate him, right? I mean, they know that because it was no secret. It was very public and the media covered it naturally, like it was the only thing happening for 2 years. And one of the challenges I think with places like Russia, places like China, places like North Korea, they don't have that, so it is harder for the rest of the world, the citizens of the rest of the world, not so necessarily, those in government, but the laymen like Lance and I who don't have access to security briefings and so forth to really get a grasp on just how deep discontent is amongst people, because we don't have a way to measure it.
So all of that said,
the same way.
With all of that said though, which is good, we've laid it all out. Now, what are we going to do about Putin and Russia and about, groups like 29155 and Putin's stated plan of this is how we destabilize the world so Russia can come back into power. How do you think we should handle it with the social media and the world citizenship idea of the younger generations? Because I don't think my idea is going to be the same as yours because there is the age difference. So with what you've just explained, how social media helps people see, or some people see the differences in things, how do you think we should handle this as a country? How do we handle from Putin and Russia with his stated objective of destabilizing the world?
From a 60,000 foot view, because you know that I like to say, well, what's the root of the problem, right? What's the core? To me, the core goes back to Vladimir Putin. And I'm not trying to demonize the man, okay? I'm saying anybody else who shared the same characteristics of Putin in charge, somebody who believes that the Soviet Union was the end all be all. You can't have that person in charge of what's supposed to be a democracy and expect that we will ever manage a real, live, peaceful relationship with Russia that has any kind of longevity. Because we can't. Because he sees us as the antithesis of everything that he wants to be, So there is no, I guess my point here is, it's not that you can't, it's not that there's not a way to get people to see the light, but I don't think that that's an effective use of time to ever believe that Putin's the guy that really we can ever get anything done with to make ourselves safe and to reach some kind of truce.
So is the United States and their seemingly close ties with Vladimir Putin, from government official to government official, those close ties, is that being done so we can keep an eye on Putin, or is it being done because we too want to destabilize our leader wants to destabilize some of the Western European power on the world? Because, President Trump he said, I don't want to be a part of NATO. I don't want to be a part of climate change organizations.
He thinks they're a bad deal for us.
Right. For the United States. Okay. Right. So by supporting or turning a blind eye or turning our backs on what Russia is doing, in turn, you could argue that those things are helping accomplish the agenda that President Trump has set out.
Right. I mean, I think that.
So what's leading to, in your mind, what do you think is leading to this relationship that we see? Is our president being doofed by a foreign leader, or is this part of President Trump's plan to get us out of these organizations that he does not think are good deals for us, and he's letting Putin do the dirty work for him? Or is there?
I think it's some hybrid.
Is there a C?
Yeah, I mean, I think Putin is trained in all of this type of stuff. I mean, in sabotage and secrecy, in counterterrorism. I mean, literally, that's the man's background. That's what he did his whole life before he entered politics. So there's two totally different. On the one hand, I think what President Trump sees is somebody that he can get along with because he believes that they share common threads. On the other hand, I think that if you got the truth out of Putin, he doesn't see that at all. He does not look at Trump as an equal. He does not respect the man.
He's playing him.
Right. Well, he would like to. The question is how much of that is he getting? But that's who Putin is. I mean, he plays probably everybody. I mean, I wouldn't want to work for the man because I think
because if you go against him, he kills you.
Well, yeah, that too.
He has you killed.
Right. That's, yeah.
I hope the audience is understanding. We've kind of turned the tables, and I'm asking you because my attitude is you can't trust them. We shouldn't be talking to them, and they should be I think arch enemy number 1 or 2 behind. And we
have to begin a public. Because you asked what the solution is. The solution is no more Putin, in my mind. I mean, that's step 1. Because
so we agree there.
Right. As long as Putin's there, the hope of getting back to what Yeltsin and some of the good Russians who really did believe that this was the direction
tried to change their
wanted
government,
to try to go that way. Mm-hmm. I mean, they really did. They didn't do the best job, but it's messy. I mean, we were a mess.
Sure.
People forget that
it takes time.
Right. Our Articles of Confederation were a nightmare. They didn't work worth crap. So, that's how it goes. You have to learn what works for you. The problem is that it got shut down because following one of the men in Russia who was trying to do hopefully the right thing, and trying to get this new government up and running, this new nation, immediately preceded by somebody who has never had that intent. He's had the intent of, we can call it a democracy if it makes people happy. I could care less, but secretly, and not so secretly, right, I want to centralize power back to what we had before. So I think that's step one. As far as how you get there, I think we have to be more publicly clear that the enemy, right, is not the Russian government, is not the Russian constitution, is not the Russian people. It's one man and one man alone. And we have to use what we've done in past wars and get the information campaign going, break through Russian barriers, get information to their people so the people can do what people do. And I don't think President Putin would have a 60% approval rate if people really had the full picture. I just don't. But they don't have it because they have a president who has no interest in letting them have the full picture. So I think we can be tougher, but I don't think it's just about being tough. It's about actively working and acknowledging it to the world. Yeah, we don't like Putin. He's not the right guy for Russia. Who are we to say so?
But that's not what we're doing right now.
No, it's not.
In any form or fashion.
No. But in fairness too, not necessarily to Trump, but just, Obama, Bush, I don't think any of them had the right approach. Some of them had a better approach, but mostly it's been keep them at arm's length, and that's that, and denounce their ugly actions. I think we have to get serious about, we made a mistake post-World War II, and we didn't stay involved long enough. And then we made another mistake at the end of the Cold War when they were actually accepting some of our help and guidance, and we let it go too soon. We don't need to be in nation building, and Russia doesn't have to be part of the United States, but we should be willing to offer our help. Hell, we've been through this, right? We've gone through the mess.
Right.
So hopefully we can, do some pointing in the right direction. So you got to get a leader back who's serious about this. And then you've got to embrace that leader, and you've got to tie him to the hip. I think there is something to be said for the approach of keep Russia close. The problem is I think we're keeping the wrong Russian close to us, and that's Putin. He's not the right guy. It doesn't matter how close we keep him. He's never going to come over to this side. He would sooner kill himself than do that. Everything I've read, Lance, I maybe I'm off base, but I don't think so. I just don't think there's any hope that you get him to see it differently. So hopefully people have learned a little something today, right? And I'm sure they've got some thoughts. So the stateofus.org, we want to hear from them. And we've talked a lot about getting other people involved in the conversation, right, Lance?
Yep. We like that.
Yes. And to do that, you've got to share the show with people and tell people how to tune in. So Lance is going to let you know a few of the ways that you can do that.
Well, you've got the app of Stitcher and Spotify and Apple Podcast or anywhere else that fine podcasts are found.
Is Spotify still the favorite?
Yes, it is, because I like to say Spotify.
For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.